Hello, and a very warm welcome to Cultural Communication Confidence with me, Victoria Reynoldson, and a very warm welcome to episode 40, which is all about giving and receiving feedback. Now, the old saying is that feedback is a gift. However, that gift sometimes is unwanted. It's something that we don't always understand, and it can even create tension and issues in teams if we don't understand how culture impacts the way we give and receive feedback. The idea of feedback is that clearly we are sharing ideas that will help that person improve their performance, to help them to grow, but also to motivate them so they know what they're doing well and where they need to improve. But we have to acknowledge that sometimes that this is our view of the world, that even if we have gathered feedback from others in the team or others who work with this person, that is all about perspective. And our perspective is based on how we interpret that person's communication approach and their behaviors. The way that they wanted to express that communication behaviors is the way you observe it. However, you may not understand what's going on underneath, what's driving that, what their real intention was, or what their motivations were. And this is where we really need to start understanding how culture shapes the way we approach feedback. So if I start with giving you some examples of giving feedback and the cultural values that might impact this. Now, I've spoken a lot about cultural values on previous episodes, and if you want to deep dive into this topic, I'll leave a link to that episode. But let me give you some examples here. So there is one particular cultural value, which is about competitive cultures versus cooperative cultures. Now, if you're giving feedback to somebody who comes from a competitive culture, this means that they'll be very motivated to really want to know the feedback that's going to help them to win, to be their best, and they're very motivated by this. So actually, yes, they want to know what they're doing well, but they're more interested in this part. If you're giving feedback to somebody from a cooperative culture, however, you need to really bear in mind that they're more focused in this culture around harmony and working together. And also, saving face is an important value. This means that giving feedback is often done in private, one-to-one, which means that you don't lose face in front of others. Another example of a cultural value that impacts the way you give feedback is all about communication style. There is a spectrum of different approaches, but basically it's whether you are more indirect or direct in communication style. Now, if you're giving feedback to somebody who comes from a culture who is used to speaking in a direct way, then it is absolutely fine to get straight to the point, to be very clear and directional with your feedback. If you are speaking and giving feedback to somebody who comes from more of an indirect communication approach, then you might need to really think about the soft approach to this, gently building up to the developmental feedback and perhaps expressing it in a very indirect style so that they understand the messages without being too blunt and too abrupt with it. Now, that's how culture impacts how we give the feedback. What about how it's received? Now, this is interesting because if you are the leader, the manager, giving this feedback, then we may need to anticipate how people will react to us. Now, one cultural value that may impact this is expressiveness. So people who come from a low expressive culture, in this kind of context, may not seem to react to the feedback, even if it's really quite a lot of feedback, or there are a number of points that need to be improved. They may not react in a way which means that you might even feel like, do they understand? Have these messages landed with this person? But just bear in mind, people from low expressive cultures really take time to control their emotions, to come across as calm and professional, but they are still processing. So bear that in mind. If you're giving feedback to somebody who comes from a more highly expressive culture, then you may need to anticipate that there are strong emotions that come with that, both positive and potentially negative emotions. So, think about that. Think about the space they might need to express their surprise, their frustrations, even resistance to the feedback, and even tears and strong emotions like this. So that is an important part of them processing the feedback. The other final cultural dynamic I'm going to mention here today, which will impact how the feedback is received, is in how that person perceives power distance. Now, if somebody has a preference and tends to work in a way which is low power distance, that means not so hierarchical, more egalitarian, then they may be more open to discuss and question that feedback. They may even push back and challenge it. Somebody who comes from a high power distance culture, they are much more used to working in a hierarchical way. So if you're giving feedback as their manager or as a senior leader, they are much more likely to accept that feedback, not to question it, because it's come from you as the person in the position of power. Now, I hope that's really opened your eyes to some really interesting thoughts around how these cultural values impact the way we give and receive feedback. But what about the best approaches to do this? How do we do this? Well, I'm going to share with you a few steps for each area just to help you with that communication approach and to really make sure that you can get the best out of the conversations. So let's start with giving feedback. Now, what's really important about giving feedback is setting up the conversation well. So I always suggest that you flag in advance that you want to have the conversation so that somebody can be prepared for this. And clearly, with everything I've mentioned earlier today, you want to maybe explore what could be the cultural dynamics that impact that conversation. When you approach it, it's not just about giving feedback. In fact, you're not telling. You should be really approaching this as a discussion, a conversation. Remember, this is only going to be about your perception or perhaps others' perception of the situation. You should be really getting curious about how does this person see it? What were they really intending to achieve in the situation? Now, when you open up the conversation, it's worth checking they're open to listen. Even though you've done the preparation and put time in their diary, it's worth checking that you've got their attention. Particularly in a virtual meeting, you want to make sure that they're not getting distracted by other things going on in the background and that they're willing to listen to what you have to say. It's very helpful to start off with by really getting very neutral. So describe the situation and be really specific with examples. At this stage, you're trying to be quite objective. So no feelings, no interpretations, but sticking to the facts. Once you've done this, you can move into the impact of this was. Impact either to yourself, if you were personally involved, or impact to others. And this is where you can get into more subjective feedback. So I noticed, we felt, we observed, we heard you say. So this is where we can give that more detailed feedback of the impact of what they were doing. And at the same time, really acknowledge that it is your view. It is what you saw. So it is at this point that you want to then open up the conversation and really get their perception of the situation and to see whether they have a different point of view. It might be that they haven't been aware, and for them it's an acknowledgement process. It might be that they want to explain what was really going on there, and that's helpful extra information for you. But wherever the conversation discussion goes from there, it's really important that you get to a final point. And this could be about what are the next steps and recommendations, how to take this forward, whether it's about that person taking away feedback, something that they're going to concretely work on, or maybe it's about a broader discussion with the team around what's going on. So that's all about giving feedback. However, I also want to talk about receiving feedback, because actually as leaders and managers of people, you also want to make sure that you're developing this skill. And by the way, receiving feedback isn't just about hearing it. We need to really pay attention. So the first point is, it was with giving feedback, is are you really open to listen? And I mean really listen. So that means turning off all the distractions, turning off all your electronics, turning off your email, any kind of messaging that's coming through, and just being very focused on the moment. And that requires you to be quite present. Also to remove distractions from your mind about what's just happened or what's coming next. And you want to demonstrate that you're present through the way that you are showing your nonverbal communication, your body language. So make sure that if you're in person or in fact virtual, that you're showing open signals. Your body is open, that you're looking like you're listening. And if you want to learn more about listening and nonverbal communication, I've done episodes on these in the past. So again, I'll put some links in the show notes to these. Then really listen into what's being said, and then think about the cultural impact. So if you are speaking, somebody's giving you feedback and they come from a more indirect communication style, a culture that has this approach, then you will need to really pay attention to not only what is being said, but what is not being said. The silences, the pauses, how their nonverbal communication is aligned or not aligned to what they're saying. Also really pay attention to your own nonverbal communication. As I mentioned earlier, you want to really demonstrate that you're listening here. Once you've heard the feedback, even if you don't agree with it, I think it's very important to acknowledge what's been said, to check your understanding and reflect back, to make sure that you've really understood their key points and they've fully expressed it, and then to thank the other person, particularly if you are the leader or the manager of the team and this person has taken the time to give you feedback. That takes sometimes courage, and it is important to acknowledge, check understanding, and thank that person for taking the time and courage to do that. And then, again, if there is some sense of dissonance, you don't feel that you agree with this feedback, I would perhaps not express that in the meeting itself. In fact, I would be taking it away and really reflecting on it. What does this mean? What is the gift in this feedback? What can I learn about myself? And what is it that I'm not seeing? What are my blind spots here? And then follow up. It is incredibly important if somebody's again taking that time to give you feedback, that you come back to them, even if you don't have a response immediately about what you want to do with that feedback. You come back to them and let them know how you want to take it forward. So as we come to the end of this episode, let me ask you some questions for your own reflection. What do you find easier? Do you find it easier to give feedback or to receive feedback? Have you ever considered the cultural dynamic when you've been giving and receiving feedback? And how has that changed your perception of how feedback works? I would be really curious to get your thoughts on that, so please feel free to let me know. And the other thing to say is that if you are an international executive, either already at leadership level or on your way to becoming one, and you feel that this is part of an area that you need to improve as part of elevating and amplifying your own communication skills for leadership levels, then please get in touch to find out more about my Global Executive Communication Program, which is my coaching program for individuals who really need that support as they move to the next level. And also, I want to mention that this is episode 40. It's incredibly exciting to realize that we're almost a year into making these episodes of cultural communication confidence. And I really do hope that you find these episodes valuable. I occasionally get feedback from people, and that means a lot to me. But if you do find it valuable, this is what would be an amazing step for me. It would be amazing if you could share this episode with somebody who would really benefit from it and would also find these insights valuable. For me, this is really important because this is part of my mission to really connect the world through the power of communication and cultural intelligence. If you're feeling particularly generous, then I would absolutely love it if you could rate the show, leave me a review on your podcast platform of choice, or if you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to write me a comment. Your feedback really does mean a lot to me, and it really lights me up to hear how you find this particular episode. Well, thank you so much for joining me today here on Cultural Communication Confidence, and I look forward to seeing you next time.